sovereign over all. Lord, that your will can be accomplished, even when it seems like the threats out there are challenging, Lord, but we pray for your sovereign will to be accomplished. We pray that you would be with the leaders of the United States and of Israel, Lord, and that you would help them to have wisdom as they pursue peace, even though the opponents do not really desire peace. They only desire time to rearm and do things all over again. So Lord, we pray for blessing upon our time right now. We also know that true peace will not come until the Sar Shalom returns, the Prince of Peace. But Lord, we know that in the meantime, we just pray for your favor upon our Jewish people in Israel. And Lord, we pray that our Jewish people around the world would be more open to the message that we proclaim as a result of these events. And Lord, we just ask you to bless this time as we study from your word, that we would better understand your truths, that we would draw closer to you, and that we would more effectively bring the message to those who don't know you, that we would more effectively live out these truths. And we thank you that we are able to come before you and ask these things as we ask you to lead us by your Spirit in all that we do this evening. We ask it in Messiah Yeshua's name. Amen. As we were praying, I thought of something and it left me, so we'll see if it comes back. It's about Israel and what they're oh, I know. I believe it's the Zionist Organization of America has recognized a number of groups in Israel, a number of people and some groups for blessing the nation as they're going through these difficult times. And one of they recognize like 13 different people and groups. And the first aid group that they recognized was the Joseph Project of the MJAA. Mm-hmm. So that is tremendous testimony to our people in Israel, and them being recognized by a group like the Zionist Organization is significant. So I just read that in an email today, and so I suspect we will hear about that at the conference and even hear more in the upcoming days. But that's hopefully will lead to an acknowledgement. We've seen great gains in the Messianic Jewish movement in Israel. There's still a lot of hostility, particularly from the ultra-Orthodox, but they're able to serve openly in the IDF, which wasn't the case 10 or 15 years ago. And perhaps this will lead to even being able to be recognized as Jewish and make Aliyah. All right, 1 Peter chapter 2. Peter starts out chapter 2 encouraging us to live in a different way and get rid of the stuff we used to do, slander and various worldly evil things that we are malice to get rid of, so that we might live a different way as a result of what we believe. And he uses two analogies right at the beginning of chapter 2. Anybody remember the first analogy? He talks about new believers being like newborn babies, and all they are able to use to enable them to survive and grow is milk. In most cases, mother's milk. And he then compares that to the milk of the Word, that as new believers, we are to focus on the fundamentals and try to come up with a good understanding of the basic truths. I pointed out that Frequently in sports, if a team goes on a losing streak or something like that, you have the expression, we need to get back to the fundamentals. We need to get back to the basics. And if we have a good understanding of the basics, that gives us a solid foundation for being able to go on to the meatier subjects, the more challenging subjects. So that was his first analogy. Anybody remember the second analogy? Everybody must get. It's a stone. Stone. Anyway, was that?
Terrible.
Yes, that was terrible. I should have come up with something better. People in glass houses should not throw. There we go. Okay. Which is described in 1 Peter 2, verses 4 through 8. He describes Yeshua as the living stone. And he also describes him as a cornerstone. And that's actually based on a quote from Psalm 118, verse 22, talking about the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Essentially, everybody understands that verse from Psalms to refer to the idea that Yeshua is the stone that the Jewish leaders did not recognize as the Messiah, and he's become the most important stone, and everything else is built upon what he has done. One of the reasons they didn't recognize him as Messiah is he didn't come to do what they expected him to do. The last thing they expected was a Messiah who would die, because the view of a Messiah is one who would overthrow their enemies. And dying doesn't sound like a good way to do that. However, we know and have seen and understand that his death overcomes our ultimate enemy, which is sin, the ultimate force that we are battling against, with the adversary being the one who is trying to get us to sin. And at least tempts us. And so we see in Psalm 118, verse 22, what looks like a prophecy, and Peter is describing that in that way. And again, he is now going to connect that to the word in verse 8, where it says, a stone that will make people stumble, a rock over which they will trip. They are stumbling at the word, disobeying it, as had been planned. And so one of the things that we're going to ask ourselves as we get to verse 9 is, who is stumbling at the word and disobeying it as had been planned? And we'll get to that in a minute. But one of the things is, we're going to see Peter quote 3 times in here in chapter 2 at the beginning, 3 times from the Hebrew Scriptures, which certainly gives the idea that he sees what is taking place as a fulfillment of things that were prophesied in the Hebrew Scriptures. Although there's questions as to whether or not he applies them exactly the way they were originally, the way they originally applied. And again, it is foundational. Just like milk is what starts us, and the solid understanding of Scriptures is what we build on top of to get to the meatier matters. With the cornerstone, we build up on that until we have a solid structure that can withstand anything. And once again, it's tied to the Word. And so knowledge, understanding of the Word is what I believe Peter is trying to help us to see the importance of it. He goes on to quote Isaiah 28, verse 16, look, I am laying in Zion a tested stone, a costly cornerstone, a firm foundation stone. He who trusts will not rush here and there. Our faith is built upon this tested stone in Zion, in Zion. Israel is always at the center. That's one reason that the adversary is constantly attacking Israel. If the Lord describes Jewish people as the apple of his eye, describes Zion as belonging to him, and a special place to him, then we know that that's where the adversary is going to attack and see if he can question the existence of the Jewish people, question their legitimacy in the land, and we see this over and over again in the world, especially today, to where Jewish people who are probably just as opposed to what's going on in Israel as others are still attacked simply for being Jewish. And, that shows that when, it's kind of like what Tevye said in Fiddler on the Roof. I know we're a chosen people, but couldn't you choose somebody else for a change? Because that immediately puts a target on the Jewish people as representatives of the Creator. Now, by extension, as followers of Messiah, we're in that same boat. The world, and we'll talk about this more in 1 Peter 2, it attacks us, it demeans us, and at the same time, it's watching us to see how we respond. And if we are living out our faith as though it is real under stress, and because the world knows it needs to believe, but wants to find excuses not to. Now, one thing interesting in this analogy is Peter then describes followers of Messiah, or whoever he's talking to, as living stones, just like Yeshua was described as a living stone. And he goes on to say, we are built up into a spiritual house, a holy priesthood. And then he quotes from Isaiah chapter 8, verse 14, which says, he is there to be a sanctuary, but for both the houses of Israel, he will be a stone to stumble over, a rock obstructing their way, a trap and a snare for the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And so in that verse that Peter is quoting, he describes that Yeshua is going to be this stone that they will stumble over. And so it seems to me that Peter is pointing out, in talking to Jewish believers, he is criticizing Jewish unbelievers. And he is showing how the scriptures said what they would do. Because it's talking about both the house of Israel, he will be a stone to stumble over. A trap and a snare for the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And then he goes on to say in verse 9, let's see, I'm getting a little behind. There we go. In verses 9 and 10, you are a chosen people, the king's Kohanim, a holy nation, a people for God to possess. Why? In order for you to declare the praises of the one who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Before you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. And we took a vote last time. Some of you may not have been here. But the question is, who is that verse being directed toward? Who is the you, essentially? And we'll take a vote again. This is before we discuss it. There's no wrong answer. How many believe that 1 Peter 2:9 is talking about Jewish believers only? Okay? And how many believe it's talking about Gentile believers only? Okay, so the third possibility, how many believe it's talking about believers in general, Jew and Gentile? Okay, so how many didn't vote? Okay, so this time everybody voted. So I think we had 2 who said Jewish believers, and I don't think we had any who said Gentile believers only. So let's find out. And the primary importance of resolving this question is from a standpoint of disputing replacement theology. Because if you conclude that what this verse is saying is that words that were originally used to describe the Jewish people are now describing the church, that sounds like the church is replacing the Jewish people in God's plans. And we will take a look and see if that's the case. Here's the arguments for it being, Jewish believers only, Gentile believers only, or Jewish and Gentile believers. So here's the arguments for Jewish believers only. The you then is the Jewish believers, and the they is Jewish unbelievers. And so, because that's who Peter just talked about in 1 Peter 2, verse 7, which, let's see, I have that. 1 Peter 2, verse 7 says, "Now to you who keep trusting, he is precious. But to those who are not trusting, the very stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone." So the question is, who is you who keep trusting, and who is those who are not trusting? And so if you who keep trusting is now the church, then those who are not trusting is going to be the unbelieving pagan world. But it could also be Jewish believers are the ones who keep trusting, and Jewish unbelievers are the ones who are not yet trusting. You could almost put in the word yet, that or who have chosen thus far not to trust. Because it's Peter's quoting verses from the Hebrew Scriptures, which I think is one of the things I'll point out. Yes, the terminology that he's using is from the Hebrew Scriptures. That passage is actually Exodus chapter 19, verses 5 and 6. And here it is in the New American Standard, because I don't want to read a Messianic translation, because they may be influenced by a Messianic viewpoint. So it says, "Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel." And the interesting thing is, if we're talking about Jewish believers, then they would know this passage from Exodus, which is based on obeying his voice and keeping his covenant. Whereas when you pick up the passage right in the middle, it just says, okay, here's a blessing that I'm bestowing, but it's like the conditional aspect of it has been lost. And you could almost interpret this as, you behave any way you want, and you're still part of that royal priesthood, chosen nation, and holy nation, royal priesthood. And so now there's another passage that we're hearing in 1 Peter 2:9, and that's Isaiah 43 verses 20 and 21, which says, actually the second part of 43:20, "Because I have given waters in the wilderness and rivers in the desert to give drink to my chosen people, the people whom I formed for myself will declare my praise." And so that's very similar to in 1 Peter 2:9. Why? In order for you to declare the praises of the one who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. So all of these things could very well apply to the Jewish people. They're contained in prophecies that said that that was what the Lord would do. And then in Hosea 2, verse 25 or 23, depending on the translation, it says, I will sow, you all know, you've heard it enough, and we see it in this passage. It's the names of Hosea and Gomer's children that the Lord instructed them to give them these names. And so in 2 verse 23 it says, I will sow her for myself in the land. I will also have compassion on her who had not obtained compassion. And I will say to those who were not my people, you are my people. And they will say, you are my God. Now, a church that historically wants to understand verses in the New Testament of blessing as being about them and no longer talking about the Jewish people are saying, hey, we're the people who weren't his people. And now we are his people. And then we are able to say, you are my God, which is actually a line that we find in all the covenants. I will be their God and they will be my people. And as we know from Romans 9:4, all of those covenants were made with the Jewish people, with the house of Israel. And so we have to step back a little bit because the church's historic understanding is coming from a replacement theology perspective. And therefore, they interpret these phrases to be about them as the primary way of understanding them. So this sounds like it could be Gentiles, but as we pointed out, in all three of these cases, the words were originally applied to the Jewish people. This is also consistent with, if you'll remember in 1 Peter 1:1, it talks about the chosen, the elect sojourners in the diaspora is the best way to translate the Greek. And once again, the church has a bias to want to see the Gentiles in that description. But the term diaspora is generally used in association with the Jewish people and the idea that they were going to be scattered. So this could be affirming Jewish believers' identity as still being the chosen, the holy nation, the royal priesthood. Even though they are in Asia Minor, they're in the midst of a primarily Gentile culture. Also, if this is both Jews and Gentiles, and it's not in the Greek, in the original language, the word also would have really helped. If we're including Gentiles with Peter, who is the apostle to the Jews, all he would have to do is say, and now the Gentiles are also a royal priesthood and a holy nation. But the word also isn't there. And so the question is this just reaffirming the Jewish calling, or is this changing it? Now, it also talked about being called out of darkness into his marvelous light. Well, also to indicate explicit inclusion of Gentiles. In Isaiah 2 verse 5 it says, and we sing a song that is based on this verse, come house of Jacob and let us walk in the light of the Lord. Once again directed to the Jewish people. Isaiah 60 verses 1 through 3 says, arise and shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For behold, darkness will cover the earth, and deep darkness the peoples. But the Lord will rise upon you, and his glory will appear upon you. Nations will come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your rising. So those are the arguments that I came up with. And in refuting some of the other ones or presenting those, we may even see a little bit more evidence. We'll have to take a look. But that's the argument, that Peter is talking to Jewish believers in 1 Peter 2, 9 and 10, and 11 and 12 for that matter. And we'll see if we get that far. But now, is it the Gentiles only? As I said, this is the historic bias of the church based on replacement theology. And to refute it, one of the questions we could ask is, why would the apostle to the Jews apply promises made to the Jewish people to the Gentiles? But the arguments in favor are that there's descriptions of waywardness in 1 Peter. And so maybe we should understand the whole book as not talking to Jewish believers, but talking to Gentiles or the church. In 1 Peter 1:18, we talked about, it describes the worthless way of life that your fathers presented to you. And so a lot of people say the worthless way of life was paganism. Of course, when we went through that, we also argued that the worthless way of life could be trying to obtain righteousness through Torah obedience. And so we're able to see that either way, but some argue that as being a description of the paganism that was the Gentiles' former state. Also in 1 Peter 4, verses 3 and 4, it says, "For the time already past is sufficient for you to have carried out the desire of the Gentiles, having pursued a course of sensuality, lust, drunkenness, carousing, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries." In other words, everybody must get stoned. Anyway, saving myself. In all this, they are surprised that you do not run with them into the same excesses of dissipation, and they malign you. So there are people who want to interpret those two verses in 1 Peter as the pursuit of pleasure that exists in the pagan world, that the Gentiles would have. This would be a description of their former way of life, and this would be saying to them, do not fall back into that. Another aspect is that Gentiles outnumber the Jewish people in Asia Minor, which is the area that's mentioned in 1 Peter 1, where the people are that Peter's writing this letter. So it could be that Peter's writing to this group as a foreign group compared to the Jewish locales in Israel, in Jerusalem, that are much more Jewish-centered. Once again, if it had said also, it would have precluded replacement theology thinking for those who interpret 1 Peter 2, verse 9 in that way. However, I want to put up on the screen what Paul says in Ephesians chapter 2 and 3, because there's some important concepts that I have underlined that, and of course we all know from Romans 11, when we studied the olive tree analogy, that we saw that the olive tree was composed of natural branches and the wild olive branches, the grafted in branches, and the Gentiles there were warned not to be arrogant against the natural branches. But in Ephesians 2, wait a minute, where'd it go? I'm doing it after Jews. Well, I'm going to go to it now. It makes more sense. We'll come back. Ephesians 2, verses 19 and 22. Oh, I know why. Okay, I will do it after that. That does make more sense. Okay, so Jewish and Gentile believers, which got the majority of votes. Not that this is a democratic world, but nonetheless, you might be right. Jeremy.
So, one of my experiences is when I've encountered Gentile believers, and I tell them I'm a Jew who follows Messiah, they would start saying that I'm part of the community too because I'm following Messiah. But I also feel like they're trying to convince me that we don't have to follow the appointed times or some of the other aspects that would be Jewish.
Because it's the way you described it. They are saying they are the body of believers and they're allowing you to be a part of it. That because you've come to faith, your Jewishness before you believed kept you out, but now you've come to faith, and so now you can be just like them. And the important part is being just like them. But that's why I wanted to we'll talk about Jew and Gentile, and then we'll talk about what Paul says in Ephesians 2, which is a refutation, shall we say, of that approach.
Is that similar to Judaizing the Gentiles in the body of believers? Because I remember there was like a situation in Acts where there was Judaizing of the Gentiles to be more Jewish if they're following Messiah.
Where in Acts? Because I think it's in Galatians.
Or I thought it was in Acts. I know it was somewhere in the writings of Paul.
Everything in Acts 15.
Acts 15, okay.
Because it's part of the debate, and they say that one group came to them in Antioch and said they had to get circumcised in order to be in community. So that might be what you're thinking.
Right.
Yeah.
This is something that as Jewish believers, and as a Messianic community, we deal with a church that developed its theology between essentially 70 AD and 1948. That most of its fundamental documents and teachings have been established over that long time period. And that countering that is seen as not accepting the historical traditions that have been established over many, many years. But the reality is 1948 turned church understanding on its head, because the body of believers at that point, and I don't necessarily blame them, saw all these verses about blessing to the Jewish people that didn't seem to be taking place in a physical sense, and therefore they came up with the spiritual conclusion that the people that God was going to bless were the followers of Messiah, which was the church by and large at that point. Very few Jewish believers in the church through the years. It's been kind of a recent phenomenon, like the last 100 years or so, maybe a little bit more. Maybe when Aliyah started taking place to Israel, which was around 1860s or so, is when we started seeing Jewish people coming to faith. But they have been slow, and interestingly, even if their theology was moving in that direction, the events of October 7th have caused the church. There's a small minority that is very, very strongly pro-Israel, even though Israel's under attack from so many different directions and being bombarded with Arab propaganda. But a lot of church people who were moderately pro-Israel, especially the younger people, have moved in the opposite direction. And so I would say any progress we were making in terms of the body of believers as a whole has probably more retreated since October 7th than advanced. Now, the people who have been strongly pro-Israel, they're even stronger now. And so that's the good news. But people who were kind of, we really should kind of approach it this way, they've seen reasons they feel that they can't really take that stand as much. So for applying Israel's terminology to Gentiles to emphasize Gentile inclusion. So that might be why 1 Peter 2 verse 9 could be talking about inclusion of Gentiles. And that's actually Stern's conclusion in terms of he thinks it's talking to both. Peter is writing to an area where both Jews and Gentiles lived. As I mentioned, Gentiles are actually dominant in that area. However, if some of this passage is written to Jewish believers, which most commentaries say that is the primary direction based on 1 Peter 1:1, then we now have to decide. It's kind of like the book of Revelation. To interpret the book of Revelation, it depends on what your view of the end times is. Whether or not Yeshua is going to be pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib, no trib at all, pre-millennial, post-millennial, amillennial. There's all those variations, and that influences how you interpret the verse, which is one reason I've been to studies on Revelation, and basically what the book of Revelation, and what you see is people debating their theologies as they interpret various verses. But we're going to be forced into something similar as we go through 1 Peter to decide. And I would say that the one thing that's true, and we mentioned this from the beginning, Peter writes in a way that has general application for the followers of Messiah. It is not primarily Jewish specific in terms of what he is describing. And so even regardless of who we conclude 1 Peter 2:9 is applying to, still the general guidance that Peter provides in these letters, I think are good for us to understand as believers. And we will even use that terminology a lot. That his analogy of the milk, we said, was for new believers. We didn't say new Jewish believers. So, we do view things in that way regardless. But, all right, so now here's the verses I talked about from Ephesians. Yes, Kathy.
What is the difference between a pagan and a Gentile?
All right, so pagans are godless. They may, or certainly don't accept the one God that we believe in. And so they have practices that support many gods and do many things that the God of Israel has told his people not to do, like child sacrifice. And there's a lot of pursuit of pleasure in the pagan world. And there's rituals that God's people, there's glorification of death and blood and things like that we're not to do those types of things. And so basically the way the scriptures tend to describe it is pagans are the former state of Gentiles who have come to believe. Gentiles simply, the word that we translate as Gentiles really means from the nations. But the nations were largely pagan. And so those from the nations were pagans in most cases, and then have come to believe. Now, Jew and Gentile, a Gentile is somebody who's not Jewish. You have the Jewish people as the focus of God's plan, and then you had those from the surrounding nations that they were to be a light to, right? They're called to be a light to the nations. But there are words for pagan. So a lot of times nations doesn't imply paganism, but often when it's talked about a former state, for Gentiles it's talking about paganism. Jews, their former state is not paganism. Their former state is legalism. And so that's kind of the difference. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
It was in the 10th anyway. Pagans are basically viewed completely negative. Gentiles are not. Gentiles are just a category that is not Jewish. And so unbelieving Gentiles are pagans, and believing Gentiles, as we're going to see right here in Ephesians 2, 19 through 22, Paul says, You are no longer strangers and aliens. And I underline that because we're going to see that in the passage in Peter next week. But you are fellow citizens with the saints. Notice the word fellow. And this is, Paul's talking, but this is the New American Standard. This is not a Messianic translation. You are of God's household, having been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Messiah Yeshua himself being the cornerstone, in whom the whole building, being fitted together, is growing into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you are also being built together into a dwelling of God in the Spirit. And then just a few verses later, beginning of chapter 3, by referring to this, when you read, you can understand my insight into the mystery of Messiah, which in other generations, mystery usually is going to mean something that hasn't been revealed but is now being revealed. In other generations was not made known to the sons of men, as it has now been revealed to his holy apostles and prophets in the Spirit, to be specific that the Gentiles, those from the nations, are fellow heirs and fellow members of the body, if they're followers of Messiah, and fellow partakers of the promise in Messiah Yeshua through the gospel. And so Ephesians emphasizes that we are one in the Messiah, that we are able to share in the blessing. That, as Jeremy described it, they were kind of welcoming him to the body as long as he did things the way they understood it. The reality is, it's really the Jewish believers who are welcoming the Gentiles into what is a faith that is built on a Jewish foundation. The concept of Messiah is a Jewish concept. But the Gentiles are able to completely be co-heirs, to share as members of the body, and to partake even in the blessings and the promises. And that is something that the Jewish people at the time were not expecting. And that's a reminder that there are no second-class citizens in God's kingdom. That the calling, you don't need to become Jewish. Many people feel like all the blessing is going to Jewish people. Now, of course, this is a modern phenomenon. For hundreds of years, nobody was looking to proclaim their Jewishness. It was much more the other way around. A lot of Jewish people denied their Jewishness, and very few Gentiles were converting to Judaism. But today we live in an age where seeing God's fulfillment to the Jewish people with the reestablishment in the land of Israel, there are many people who say, I want to be a part of that. And the reality is, you are a part of that if you are a follower of Messiah. But so many in the church world do not understand it that way, that there are many Gentiles who feel like they're being treated as second-class citizens. And it's important that we, do all we can to make sure that that is not the case. And that was probably a mistake made in some Messianic congregations in earlier days, that they were kind of lording it over the Gentiles, which we're warned not to do. It's actually the Gentiles who tend to do things that way, and we're not supposed to do things that way. So hopefully in this congregation, we use the term Gentile and we don't use it in a derogatory way. It's kind of like the way Jewish people view who's a Christian. If your parents are Christian, and by that they mean they're not Jewish, they belong to a Christian faith, then you're a Christian. And the reality is, if your parents are Gentiles, then you're a Gentile. And if your parents are Jewish, then you're Jewish. And that's just in terms of our calling and in terms of God continuing to maintain the distinctiveness for his purposes. And the adversary would have everything blend together and conclude that there's neither Jew nor Gentile anymore. Of course, by that reasoning, which is based on Galatians 3, verses 28 and 29, male and female are exactly the same as well, which we actually see our world trying to achieve. And we see that that's kind of a difficult thing to accomplish. So anyway, those are my arguments. Now we're going to, let's see. Oh, yeah, now we're going to, so we covered verse 9. Next week we'll cover verse 10, which are the quotes from Hosea, and try and figure out who that's talking about. And then after we talk about, I guess once we complete the passage, which is through, I believe, verse 12 or 13, I forget. I'm pretty sure it's 12. Then we'll re-vote and see what everybody thinks. All right, let's, any questions or comments before we jump to the Ibri?
Rabbi, can you go back one screen? For the verse?
Certainly.
Thank you.
I can even grab a drink while we are transitioning. So the bottom line is we've got to make sure that we're not making distinctions that the Lord isn't making, or making them for our own purposes rather than for his purposes, which in some case we may not fully know. But the adversary would love to see, Yeshua in Ephesians 2 described Jew and Gentile overcoming the natural enmity that exists because of their cultural differences and becoming a new organism, the one new man, as we see ourselves as one and as we see ourselves as equals individually in what the Lord is doing in the body of believers.